Started. This is the voice of Matt Burke. I am the Director of Sales for Softlanding. And Ellen and Gino, Greg, and guest, you are here to chat with us today for the next hour on the topic of application modernization, or in other words, doing application development, management in a way that reflects the fact that we're in a new era, the era of the cloud. Lots of new opportunities to talk about, lots of great work. This is a topic of great passion for us. Before we go too far and I introduce Oliver formally to you, I just want to let you know briefly who we are. So Softlanding is a Vancouver-based Microsoft partner, and we're very much focused in the space of Microsoft's cloud technologies. We've been around for 17 years, got about 50 staff, and we're one of only 3 Tier 1 system integration partners in Canada and the only one in British Columbia. We have 4 big pillars to our business. The first is all around Microsoft's productivity stack, Office 365, Skype voice, Skype video, those kinds of things. The second is all around infrastructure, including Microsoft's management tools, both on-prem, so System Center and ITSM, and in the cloud, such as EMS, and also loads and loads of Azure infrastructure work we're doing. Our third pillar, and that's the one that we're talking to you about today, is all around application development, whether it's based on SharePoint, whether it's based on Azure, and whether it's modern or let's call it legacy. And then our fourth pillar is security. We also have a large managed services department. So without further ado, please let me introduce to you Oliver Wirkus. He is one of our senior consultants in our application modernization team. Oliver is an MVP at Microsoft. He's well published, and he is incredibly knowledgeable on this topic that he's going to be talking with you about today. So without further ado, Oliver, let's go.
Thank you very much, Matt. And yeah, welcome to this webinar. And as Matt just mentioned, okay, let's jump right in and start with the first slide. And this is not what I'm going to talk about. So this is not app modernization, what I'm showing you here in the first slide. So I think that's the wrong way. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing here an old console application, and I'm not going to talk about how to modernize that app, how to transfer that to a modern Windows Forms application. App modernization is much more, and there's much more benefit for you or for enterprises. I'm going to talk about that in the next 40 minutes. So let's have a look on why we are talking about app modernization and what are the reasons why we think app modernization is one of the hot topics in 2017. So the first reason, I think, is that the SharePoint focus is drifting to Office 365 and away from SharePoint on premises. So this does not mean that SharePoint on premises is going to die soon. As we all know, SharePoint 2016 is available as an on-premise installation, and my personal guess is that the next version of SharePoint will be available as an on-premises installation as well, but that's just my personal guess. But we all know that the SharePoint focus of Microsoft is drifting from SharePoint to Office 365 to SharePoint Online and to the cloud. And you see it when you look at all the cool new features that Microsoft is publishing currently. All those new features are published to SharePoint Online and Office 365 first, and just a very few of them will make their way to SharePoint on premises. The next reason why I think app modernization is a very hot topic is that the SharePoint development paradigm is changing comprehensively. So what does that mean? So in a nutshell, this means that we're drifting away from the old server-side code web parts to the new app parts that are just using client-side code. Microsoft has released a few frameworks, and just yesterday they announced that the SharePoint framework called SPFX has reached global availability. And as you can see, the SharePoint development paradigm is changing from server-side code to client-side code. And I will talk on that in just a few minutes, and I'll give you some more details on that. But let's first have a look at the third reason why I think app modernization is a very important topic for enterprises. And that's because Azure has become a powerful platform for infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. When Azure started some years ago, it was a very powerful platform for infrastructure as a service and software as a service. So infrastructure as a service means that you can host your local environment in Azure. So this would enable you to move your local SharePoint farm up to the cloud. And software as a service means, well, yeah, software that you can subscribe to, for example, like Office 365. But in recent years, Microsoft Azure has become a very powerful platform for development as well, and this is called PaaS, Platform as a Service. So this means that developers can use Azure as a platform to develop their business applications. This is very beneficial for developers and for companies, enterprises. And I'm talking about that in just a couple of minutes and give you some additional insights here. But those are the three reasons why I think app modernization is a very hot topic in 2017, and it's very important for enterprises if they are thinking to move to the cloud. I just talked about the changes in the development paradigm, and I would like to provide some details on that. Here on that slide, you can see, well, the success story of SharePoint. SharePoint began in, I think, 2001 as a SharePoint portal server, and we're currently at SharePoint 2016. But when you look at that slide here, you see that there are some changes here. Former versions of SharePoint just allowed to create business applications based on server-side code. So what does that mean? Well, at the beginning, we created web parts, and we used the server-side code for that. We deployed the web parts to SharePoint, and those web parts were running fine, but they were also running within the same environment as our SharePoint server. And that changed. If you look at SharePoint 2010 or even SharePoint 2013, which was released in 2012, another very important software product has been published at that time, and that was Office 365, which includes SharePoint Online. And now, there was a different type of SharePoint available to the public, and this SharePoint wasn't hosted in a local infrastructure anymore. It was hosted in the cloud. It was hosted by Microsoft. And that's the reason why business applications or custom code that is based on server-side code can't be executed in the cloud. Because of that, Microsoft needed to find a new way of how to enhance SharePoint functionality by custom code. And this is what you can see at the bottom of that slide here. So in 2012, Microsoft released the app model. And app model was a kind of development paradigm, and this paradigm was focusing on client-side code. And today we have the new SharePoint framework, which was announced yesterday to reach global availability. And this SharePoint framework, that will be the new framework for all developers to be used to create SharePoint extensions or business applications in SharePoint. So as you can see here on that slide, in a nutshell, is this. We started in 2001 with server-side code that needs to be fully trusted. And today we're using client-side code to enhance the SharePoint functionality. This is what I mean with the development paradigm of SharePoint has changed dramatically. So in a nutshell, I think it's time for a quick summary. Now, I talked a lot about SharePoint and SharePoint code. So let me give you a first summary. If you have business applications deployed to SharePoint on premises, which means the SharePoint is hosted in your local environment, or if you're using business applications that have been developed for an older version of SharePoint, like SharePoint 2007 or SharePoint 2010. If one of those is true for you and you're thinking about to migrate to the cloud, you're thinking about using Office 365, you're thinking about using SharePoint Online, then you need to stop. There are some important things that you need to know. One of these important things is that server-side code is not allowed in the cloud, so you can't execute server-side code in SharePoint Online because it's hosted in a Microsoft environment. And the UI and UX of the branding has changed. So if you have created a business application, let's say for SharePoint 2007, and you're thinking of moving to the cloud, and you're thinking about using SharePoint Online, which is very similar to SharePoint 2016 in terms of UI, then you probably want to rethink your plans, because your older business application, which has been developed for SharePoint 2007, would probably use a different UI compared to the modern version of SharePoint that we have today. So I talked a lot about server-side code and client-side code, and let's have a closer look on server-side code and what is server-side code and what are the basic facts you need to know. So I titled this slide, "What's wrong with server-side code?" And if you ask me, well, I would answer, well, there's nothing wrong with server-side code. Server-side code is still a valid option to create custom software. But there's, well, some things you need to know, some drawbacks of server-side code when you're thinking of moving to the cloud. So first, let's see what is server-side code. Server-side code executes on a SharePoint server directly. So this means that your custom development and your custom business applications are hosted on the same SharePoint server as your SharePoint farm, and they're sharing the resources of that. Server-side code has access to the complete and powerful SharePoint API, and the SharePoint API is one of the most powerful APIs I have ever seen. And that's the reason why developers really like to create business application based on server-side code, because their code, their business application, was able to do almost anything that SharePoint can do. And the third very important reason is server-side code or business applications based on server-side code can be impersonated. So what does that mean? Well, let's make a quick example. Let's assume we have a SharePoint and we have a user, and this user is navigating to the current site, and on that current site this SharePoint user just has read-only permissions, which means this user is allowed to view anything that is on that site, but he's not allowed to update anything. He's not allowed to do editing or contributing. Let's further assume there is a SharePoint web part on that site, and this web part is using server-side code. And now it can happen that although the user is not allowed to change anything on that site because this user just has read-only permissions, this web part is allowed to add items to a SharePoint list, although it is running in the context of the current user, and that current user just has read-only permissions. So this is what developers call impersonation, and it can be very beneficial, but it can also be a kind of security risk. It depends on the context. So with server-side code, security risks can be possible because server-side code requires full trust. In other words, if you want to use a business application or a web part in your SharePoint environment, you need to trust that code, and you need to be absolutely sure about what this code is doing. Business applications based on server-side code in SharePoint are hard to maintain. And the reason is the powerful SharePoint API. So Microsoft published a lot of development guidelines and hints and tips and tricks that every SharePoint developer needs to know before that developer can start to create custom code based on server-side code. Server-side code or web parts based on server-side code can have a negative performance impact. This is obvious because the server-side code is running on the same server as your SharePoint farm. So it's executed on the same servers, and if the custom application is taking up too much CPU power, for example, this will slow down your SharePoint. Custom applications based on server-side code can cause trouble when you're upgrading your SharePoint. So sometimes that happens, and I've seen that quite often. Older business applications, let's say they are designed for SharePoint 2007, they can cause trouble if that SharePoint is migrated to, let's say, SharePoint 2010, 2013, or 2016. It depends on how the developers have created that code. Sometimes it can happen that this code needs to be reviewed or recompiled or even improved. There's a downtime when solutions are updated. Sure, that's true, because as I said before, business applications based on server-side code are running on a SharePoint server, and if you update some assemblies that this business application needs, there is a downtime for your SharePoint environment. Troubleshooting can also get very complicated because, as I said before, you need to have skilled developers, and these skilled developers need to know almost anything about the powerful SharePoint API, and that's the reason why troubleshooting can be very complicated. And the most important reason here is server-side code is not available in Office 365, which is obvious because if your SharePoint environment, if your Office 365 tenant is hosted within a Microsoft data center, Microsoft can't allow custom code to be executed on their servers because of the reasons I just mentioned here on that slide. So it's very important for you to know if you have business applications that are using server-side code and you're planning to move to Office 365, there's something that you need to do to be able to continue to use your business applications. So let's talk about the options you have. So let me just repeat, if you have business applications and these business applications are using server-side code and you want to move to the cloud, these are the options you have. And the most obvious option is you somehow need to replace your server-side code. Option number one is you can use a SharePoint-hosted add-in, and this add-in is using client-side code only. Option number two is you can use a so-called provider-hosted add-in, and this add-in is using client-side code for the UI and UX, which is usually hosted within your SharePoint site, and the business logic is executed on an external server. And this business logic can still use server-side code because it's not hosted in your SharePoint environment anymore. And in my mind, in my opinion, the most powerful option you have is you can use an Azure-hosted application using the Azure infrastructure and the Azure services. This is what we usually refer to as Platform as a Service, or PaaS. And in my opinion, this is the most powerful option you have. And I'm giving you some reasons in just a couple of minutes. But I would like to start with your first option, the SharePoint-hosted add-in. So SharePoint-hosted add-in, what is that? Well, SharePoint-hosted add-in is using a lightweight development environment. And those of you who have seen some demos or some videos published by Microsoft on the new SharePoint framework, or SPFX, Then you have probably seen that the development environment you use is very easy to install. So you just need to have a basic code editor like Visual Studio Code. You just need to have some additional tools, and you're done. The most important thing is you can do SharePoint development, or you can create a SharePoint hosted add-in within that environment without using SharePoint at all. That is doable. SharePoint hosted add-ins are using script code only. Microsoft has released some supporting frameworks, as I mentioned, the new SharePoint framework, SPFX, which has reached global availability now. But there are a couple of others that you can use. If you're creating a SharePoint hosted add-in, this add-in is using script code only, and it requires strict coding guidelines. Well, this is true for every professional development, but in my mind, it's very important for script code especially, because a script code is, well, it's not a typed language compared to, let's say, C#, and we need to establish some coding guidelines to be able to maintain that software in the future. SharePoint hosted add-ins are using, as I said before, script code only, and well, the functionality is limited because those add-ins need to use a kind of library that SharePoint Online is exposing, and this library has limited functionality. So if you compare that library with a powerful SharePoint API, you'll notice a huge difference. SharePoint hosted add-ins are centered around SharePoint components, which means they can use SharePoint lists, libraries, webs, permissions, users, and all those elements. And very important, the code runs under permissions of the current user, so there is no impersonation here. And there's no way to impersonate a SharePoint hosted add-in. That's something you really need to keep in mind if you're using older SharePoint web parts that use server-side code and that may use impersonation. Let's have a look on how a SharePoint hosted add-in is looking like. So in the background, you see SharePoint. So this is my yellow rectangle here. On the left side, you see a SharePoint host web, and this is a web that almost every user can access. And in that web, you see a SharePoint page, which is marked as a gray rectangle here. And on that SharePoint page, there's a very basic SharePoint hosted add-in. On the right side here, the green area, that's the so-called app web. And the app web is a kind of hidden web. And this app web is used to host SharePoint elements that a SharePoint hosted add-in needs to work. For example, that can be some lists or library that the SharePoint hosted add-in is using to store data. So the host web is accessible by every authenticated user. The app web is not visible to the users, and only admins can have access to the app web. The app web is a kind of separated web that is just used for the SharePoint hosted add-in to save its internal data to. So let's have a look on option number 2. And option number 2 is a provider hosted add-in. So what's the difference compared to a SharePoint hosted add-in? A provider hosted add-in requires two elements. We have the UI, so the user interface, and we have the business logic. This approach here is separating UI from the business logic. The first approach, which was the SharePoint hosted add-in, is not separating those. So a SharePoint hosted add-in is just one add-in that incorporates a UI and the business logic. And a provider hosted add-in has two separate elements. UI and business logic are separate. So the UI solution usually is deployed to SharePoint, and it's using script languages only, which means the UI is a user interface. So this is just can be a SharePoint hosted webin that that is saved to SharePoint, and this is just for providing the user interface. It is not providing the business logic. The business logic here in the provider-hosted add-in approach is saved or deployed to the cloud, and it's using C# or other supported languages. So this means that you create your business logic using C#, for example, and you deploy that business logic to a different server. So the business logic is not executed within your SharePoint environment anymore. The only thing that is executed within your SharePoint environment is the user interface. That's very important to know. If you want to create or build a provider-hosted add-in, you need to have a development environment, and it can be quite challenging to set that up because this development environment needs to deal with two parts. It needs to be able to deal with the business logic that is deployed to the cloud to a different server, and it also needs to deal with the UI part, which can be a SharePoint hosted add-in, which is using client-side code only, and which is a different project or even a different solution. So setting up a development environment for a provider-hosted add-in can be quite challenging. And you also need to have skilled developers, because these developers need to know how to create a business logic that is running on an external server. They need to know how to create a SharePoint hosted add-in that is providing the user interface and the forms, and they also need to know how those two components can communicate with each other, because it's very important that the user interface is able to communicate with the business logic, and the business logic is hosted somewhere else. A provider-hosted add-in usually is capable of handling multiple clients, and multiple clients in that context here means can be multiple departments or even multiple companies, because as I said before, the business logic is executed on an external server, and that external server is able to distinguish between different clients based on IDs. If you update a provider-hosted add-in, the update of the business logic does not affect the UI solution within SharePoint, because those two elements are separated. And if you update the business logic, you do that update on an external server, and this is not affecting your SharePoint server. On the other hand, if you're updating your SharePoint based UI solution, which can be a SharePoint hosted add-in, you're able to update that UI without affecting SharePoint as well. So let's have a look on how a provider-hosted add-in can look like. Here I have an example of a provider-hosted add-in. On the left side, you see the SharePoint and the SharePoint environment. So on the left side, we have SharePoint, we have our host web, and this is the web that every authenticated user can access. And on that web, there's a SharePoint page, which is the gray area here. And within the SharePoint page, there is our SharePoint hosted add-in, which is providing the user interface for our business logic. And the business logic, it is deployed to an external provider. It is deployed to a server somewhere in the cloud. And you can see that on the right side of that slide. So the green area here, this is our external provider. And this external provider is hosting the business logic, is hosting the data that can be, let's say, a SQL Server database, and is also providing our provider-hosted app. So those parts, the SharePoint on the left side, and the external cloud environment, the green part here, they're completely separated. And they're communicating through the internet. And they can do that by using CSOM, which is a client-side object model, or REST. So those are two options you have to enable both elements to communicate with each other. But it's important to keep in mind that the business logic is deployed to an external server, and the business logic is communicating with your SharePoint environment through the internet. And that's one of the main differences here. Okay, now let's switch to option number 3. And option number 3 has been the Azure hosted application. And as I said before, this is my favorite approach, and this is the approach that App Modernization is recommending. And let me just give some examples here, or some insights on an Azure hosted application and why this approach is very important for app modernization. So let's have a look at an Azure hosted application. An Azure hosted application is using a different approach, and the most interesting fact here is that approach is not relying on a SharePoint add-in framework. With an Azure hosted application, our business application, the business logic, is still hosted on a different server, but now this different server environment is Windows Azure. So the business application can use diversified services provided by Azure. And if you have an Azure subscription, and if you have been to the Azure portal, maybe the newer portal, you know what I'm talking about. So if you go to the newer Azure portal and have a look at the services, you'll see there's a huge amount of services available to you. This, to be honest, this is the magic why I think app modernization based on Azure is so powerful. But I will show you in just a couple of minutes. So let's go back to the Azure hosted application here. As I said before, the Azure hosted application is able to use all the services that are provided by Azure. Azure is providing different approaches to help your developers to create an Azure hosted application or a new business application. I will talk about these approaches shortly. Depending on the approach, there can be a separate UI solution in SharePoint, and this might be very interesting for you. Business applications based on Azure are reusable, and they're not tied to SharePoint anymore. What does it mean? So I'm not talking about business applications that are not using SharePoint anymore, but this means that a business application based on this approach here can be used without SharePoint, but it still can be tied with SharePoint. So you still have your business application, your business logic in Azure, and you have your UI and UX in SharePoint, very similar to the provider-hosted add-in approach. So this is the reason why I think this approach is so powerful. Here on this slide, you see some of the services that Azure is providing. And as you can see here, Azure is providing a lot of different services. So let me give you an example here. If you look to the right side of this slide here, you see a green rectangle titled with data. And here in this data area, you can see that Azure is providing a SQL database, it's providing the Azure table storage, it's providing a Redis cache, it's providing a document DB. So this is just one example why I think a business application can benefit from the services that Azure is providing. Because almost any business application is using some kind of database to store its data to. But sometimes it can be beneficial not to use a SQL Server database. So for example, if you have a business application and this business application is saving, let's say, huge video files or huge images, in that case, a SQL Server might not be the best approach for you because huge blobs of data can slow down a SQL Server. In that case, well, an Azure storage or blob storage would be more efficient. Or if your business application is just dealing with a small amount of data, it might not be effective to use a dedicated SQL Server and a SQL Server database. In that case, using the Azure table storage might be beneficial for your business application, because it's faster and you don't need to have a dedicated SQL Server anymore. So these have been just two examples why I think modern business applications can benefit from the services that are provided by Azure. But if you look on this here, you probably see more services that might be of interest for you in your special context for your business application. It can be, for example, the IoT things, so Internet of Things, or a mobile interface. So, as I said, these are the services that Azure is providing, and the App Modernization approach is benefiting from these services that Azure is providing here. I just talked about the types of Azure applications, and Azure is providing 4 different, let's call them templates, that assist your developers in creating an application in Azure. So let's have a look at these 4 approaches here. So the blue one here, it's called the App Service Approach, and this is the regular, or this is the common web service approach. So with this approach, Azure is assisting your developers to create a web application in the cloud. This is the most common approach for business applications in the cloud. On the right side of the app service, there's a service fabric approach. This service fabric approach is beneficial for huge business applications. Huge means here, let's say, huge can be an online shop, for example, right? Like the Amazon online shop, or the or eBay, or whatever platform. So Service Fabric is a different approach. Service Fabric is not focusing on one business application in the cloud anymore, but Service Fabric is more like services in the cloud. So these services are loosely coupled, and these services are communicating with each other by exchanging messages. So there can be a service that is handling logged in users. There's another service that is handling a database, for example, or a warehouse. There's another service that is handling reporting. Another service is handling any transactions or any orders, and so on. So a microservice approach, a service fabric approach, is beneficial if you have a lot of services that need to be working together, that need to exchange messages to build your business application. The green area on the right, that is the usual cloud service, and this service just means that you can take your existing environment and move it to the cloud. So it's not a PaaS approach here. It's not a platform as a service approach here, and it won't help you with development in Azure. But I just added this approach, the cloud services approach here, to provide you with a complete image of all the templates that Azure is providing to assist your developers. On the left side, in orange, you can see Azure Functions, and Azure Functions can be very beneficial for a business application in the cloud, because Azure Functions can be executed without a server. So this might sound strange, but think of Azure Functions as a kind of scripting, or kind of PowerShell in the cloud. So Azure Functions are used to react on external events. So let me just give you a quick example here. So you can take your code, your scripting code, deploy it to Azure, and join that code with an external event, and every time that external event is triggered, your code is executed. And think of Azure Functions as a kind of scripting companion for your business application. So these are the type of Azure applications that your developers can use to bring your existing web application to the cloud. So let me give you an example of how this can look like, and I think you will agree that the approach of having your business application in the Azure cloud is very beneficial and is providing a lot of benefit to your company, to your employees, and to the business application itself. So let's have a look on this slide here. So the green area, this is Windows Azure. So this is the Azure environment. This is your subscription in Azure. The blue area here, which is titled Business Application, this is your business application. This is your new business application. So you have your old business application, you transformed it to a web application, and you deployed that web application to Windows Azure. So this is the usual approach that companies need to take if they want to be able to execute their existing business applications which are using server-side code in the cloud. So, and now let's have a look at App Modernization comes into play and how App Modernization is helping you to modernize your app. So step one can be your business application is now able to use Azure Storage and all the Azure services and all of the Azure infrastructure. Azure Storage means, and I mentioned that before, Azure is providing different options for your business application to save data to. So you're not tied to a SQL server with a SQL Server database anymore, but you can choose between options that are best for your business application. Like I said before, if you're just using a small amount of data, you don't need to have a huge SQL Server and SQL Server database. You just can use an Azure Table Storage, for example. All the Azure services are available to your business application, and some of them can be very beneficial. For example, with Azure services, you can very easily add some kind of voice recognition to your business application. Or you can use all the functions and all the services that Azure is providing. And Azure infrastructure means here your business application has access to all the infrastructure elements that Azure is providing, including load balancing, scale up, scale down, and all that, and all these cool features. So just a quick example here. If you have a business application and you're moving that business application to the cloud, your business application might benefit a lot from being able to scale up and scale down based on, let's say, how many users are currently using your business application. This can be very easily achieved in Azure, but if you having your business application deployed to your local environment, scale up and scale down is very hard to do. But there's much more that Azure is offering to modernize your application. So you can add a SharePoint UI to your business application. So here on the right side we have our SharePoint environment, our SharePoint Online or Office 365 environment. And if you want to be able to use your business application that has been hosted in Windows Azure within your SharePoint environment, the only thing you need to do is just deploy a basic user interface to your SharePoint. And all your users will be able to communicate with the business application through a UI that is deployed to SharePoint directly. But there's more. Your business application can also use SharePoint elements like SharePoint lists and libraries. So if you have a business application that needs to deal with data that is saved to a SharePoint generic list, for example, or a SharePoint document library, can be done very easily. You just use CSOM or REST, and with these technologies, your business application can access SharePoint elements that are saved to your SharePoint tenant or your Office 365 tenant. But there's more. Have you heard of Flow? Flow is a cool and new application that Microsoft published recently, and Flow can be used to add workflows to your business application. So Flow is a kind of Flow is connecting your business application that is hosted in Windows Azure with your SharePoint online environment. So with Flow, you can trigger workflows, and these workflows can trigger actions in your business application and vice versa. So, for example, if your business application needs some time to do some internal calculation, it can trigger your SharePoint as soon as it is done with that calculation and is now able to return the data. So Flow is a cool alternative to, let's say, SharePoint workflows and the SharePoint Designer workflows. There's more. Business applications. Your business application in Windows Azure can easily connect to external systems. For example, you have a business application, and this business application needs to connect to an external SAP system, for example. This can be done very easily because you're able to use the Azure infrastructure to connect to your external system. You can connect to Power BI very easily. You can connect to Reporting Engine very easily. The only thing you need to do is you need to provide a proper interface that Power BI or a reporting module can use. But usually your business applications are providing those kinds of interfaces out of the box. And last but not least, mobile application. So mobile applications, or bring your own device, is a very hot topic these days. And Microsoft is offering two options for you to add a mobile interface to your business application. And these options are Power Apps and Xamarin. And if you're following this approach here, it is very easy for you to add a mobile interface to your business applications because you already did that. If you look to the right of that slide, there's our SharePoint and the business application UI. And you can just reuse this business application UI as a UI for your mobile application very easily. You just need to tweak the forms a little bit so that they fit to the reduced size of a mobile screen, and you're almost done. Power Apps and Xamarin can communicate with your business application by using the same interface that you are using for the communication between your SharePoint UI and your business application. So as you have seen here, if you have a business application and you want to move that business application to the cloud because you want to use a Microsoft SharePoint Online or Office 365, you can simply take your business application, transform it to a web application, and host it in the cloud. But that will just help you with being able to continue to use your business application. You're not using all the cool features and all the services that Windows Azure is providing. And if you're using these features, you can not only have your business application hosted in the cloud, but you can also modernize your business application with just a little bit of additional effort. And the reason why you can do that is Azure is providing most of the services and most of the functionality you probably need to modernize your application. Okay, let's have a quick summary here. So if you are using custom business applications and think about moving to Office 365, then your application probably needs a modernization. If you want to use different front ends, like SharePoint or mobile applications, then your application might need a modernization. And I just showed you how easy it is to add a mobile interface to an existing web application hosted in SharePoint Azure, in Microsoft Azure. If you want to utilize the power and the high availability and the effortless maintenance of Azure, then your application also might need a modernization. This is what I have for you today. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask now. Or you may want to contact us by using info@softlanding.ca or sales@softlanding.ca. And at that time, I would like to pass it back to Matt.
Well, thank you, Oliver. Ellen and Gino, Joseph, guest, any questions? So this is a big topic. Last week we did one of these sessions on disaster recovery in the cloud. And I think everybody really understands clearly what their next step would be to explore that topic further. This is a much more complex and much more all-encompassing topic. But luckily there is a meaningful next step that you can take, and it's a basic assessment. To start to look through some of your applications and assess that really the opportunity to create some value with exploring these topics. And in many cases, Microsoft will pay for that assessment, either via some deployment planning days or using some Microsoft funding in a bucket called Azure Everywhere. So either using DPS or Azure Everywhere, it will be possible for you to spend some quality time with Oliver or one of our other senior consultants and really start to understand what the possible, what the potential is for you and your applications to capture some of this value that Oliver shared some information about. With that, if you have any questions for Oliver, now would definitely be the time to ask them. And if there are no questions, enjoy the rest of your Friday and your afternoon.